The first time I realized my family had made a decision without me, it wasn't dramatic. It was a Tuesday, 9:17 a.m., and my phone buzzed with an email I was CC'd on by mistake. It talked about paperwork, deadlines, signatures already submitted. I was standing in a grocery store aisle, holding a carton of eggs, rereading my own name. One line didn't make sense, and by the time I understood it, everything I believed about fairness was already gone. The first time I realized my family had made a decision without me, it wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no slammed doors, no tears. It was a Tuesday morning, 9:17 a.m., to be exact, and I was standing in the dairy aisle of a Safeway in Mesa, Arizona. I remember the time because the store was quiet in that specific way. It only is after the morning rush, but before lunch. The floor had just been mopped. The air smelled faintly like bleach and warm bread from the bakery. I was holding a carton of eggs, the cheap store brand, balanced in one hand while my phone buzzed in the other. An email. I almost ignored it. I usually do when I'm buying groceries. But I saw my last name in the preview line, and underneath it, a subject that didn't belong to me. Updated filing, final signatures attached. I opened it. I shouldn't have been able to read it so easily, but that's the thing about documents that change your life. They're never written in emotional language. They don't warn you. They don't slow down for you. They just exist. There were bullet points, dates, attachments, legal-sounding phrases I'd seen 100 times before. My name appeared twice, once in the greeting, once near the bottom, both times spelled correctly, which somehow made it worse. I stood there too long, blocking the eggs, rereading the same paragraph while a man in a baseball cap cleared his throat behind me. I moved my cart without looking at him. I put the eggs back, picked them up again, then put them back a second time. One line kept snagging in my head. As agreed, authority transferred effective immediately. Authority. Transferred. I scrolled back up, then down again. I checked the sender. My uncle. I checked the CC list. That's when I realized something else. I wasn't supposed to be there. I was included by accident, one wrong click. One extra email address autofilled because we shared a domain once, years ago, when my father was still alive and things were simpler, or at least I thought they were. My phone felt heavier in my hand. I locked it, unlocked it, opened the email again. The eggs were still in my cart. I stared at the expiration date like it might explain something. March 14th, 5 days away. I paid for my groceries like nothing had happened. The cashier asked if I wanted paper or plastic. I said paper. My voice sounded normal to me, which surprised me. Outside, the sun was already too bright, the kind of Arizona brightness that makes you squint even when you've lived there for years. I sat in my car for almost 10 minutes before starting the engine. On the drive home, I told myself it was probably a misunderstanding. Families misunderstand each other all the time. Paperwork gets messy, lawyers rush things, someone forgets to loop someone in. It didn't mean anything yet. Not really. But a quiet part of me already knew that wasn't true. Because this wasn't the first time decisions had been made around me instead of with me. It was just the first time I'd seen proof. I've lived in the same 2-bedroom townhouse for 6 years. Beige carpet, white walls, nothing fancy. The HOA complains if you leave your trash cans out too long. My neighbor across the street waters her plants every morning at exactly 6:30 a.m. I know this because I leave for work at 6:45 and she waves every time, the same small wave, like we're both part of some unspoken agreement to be polite but not close. My life is orderly, predictable. I like it that way. I work as a compliance analyst for a regional insurance firm. It's not a job people lean forward to hear about at dinner parties, which suits me just fine. My days are spent reviewing files, tracking inconsistencies, making sure regulations are followed exactly as written. No creativity, no interpretation, just facts, timestamps, and procedures. Rules make sense to me. People don't always. I grew up believing that if you did things correctly, paid attention, followed instructions, showed up when expected, you would be treated fairly. Maybe not generously, but fairly. My father believed that too. He was the kind of man who filed his taxes early and kept every receipt in labeled envelopes. He taught me how to balance a checkbook when I was 12. When he died, suddenly and inconveniently, from a heart attack in a Costco parking lot, I inherited his habits, along with his old filing cabinet. What I didn't inherit was clarity. My family reorganized itself after his death in ways I didn't fully understand at the time. Roles shifted. Authority settled where it was most comfortable. I was grieving. I didn't question much. I assumed that if something mattered, someone would tell me. That assumption is what cost me. When I got home, I put the groceries away slowly. Milk on the middle shelf, eggs in the door. Even though I knew that wasn't ideal, I washed my hands. I sat at the kitchen table with my laptop and reopened the email on a bigger screen. That's when I noticed the attachment name. Revised POA, executed. Power of attorney. The words didn't hit me all at once. They came in pieces. A dull pressure behind my eyes. A tightness in my chest that didn't quite feel like panic. More like something settling into place. My father's name was on the document. So was my uncle's. There was a notary stamp dated 3 weeks earlier. The signatures were clean, confident. No hesitation in the pen strokes. Mine was missing. I wasn't listed as a witness. I wasn't listed as an alternate. I wasn't even copied on the final version. And yet, there I was, holding the evidence that my role had been erased with administrative efficiency. I checked my phone again. No missed calls. No texts. No, hey, just wanted to give you a heads up. I waited for the anger to come. It didn't. What came instead was something colder. Understanding. They hadn't forgotten me. They'd planned around me. I thought back to the last family meeting, 6 months earlier, when we'd sat around my uncle's dining table eating dry chicken and boxed mashed potatoes. He'd talked about streamlining things and taking burdens off everyone's plate. I'd nodded, grateful someone else wanted to handle the paperwork. I'd even said thank you. I could hear my own voice now, calm and reasonable, agreeing to something I hadn't actually been invited to decide. That night, I didn't sleep much. I lay in bed listening to the hum of the air conditioner and the distant sound of traffic from the freeway. Around 2 a.m., I got up and opened the filing cabinet I'd inherited from my father. The drawers still stuck a little. Inside were tax returns, insurance policies, handwritten notes in his neat block letters. At the very back of the bottom drawer, there was a manila folder I didn't remember seeing before. No label, just a crease along the edge, like it had been opened and closed many times. I didn't open it right away. I sat on the floor with the folder in my lap, running my thumb along the paper, thinking about that email, about the eggs I'd put back twice, about how easy it is to lose something when you assume it's safe. When I finally opened the folder, I understood why no one had wanted me involved. And I understood something else, too. The version of my family I believed in, the one built on fairness, transparency, and shared responsibility, had never really existed. I just hadn't seen the paperwork yet. The folder didn't contain anything dramatic at first glance. No secret letters. No handwritten confessions. Just documents. That should have been my first clue. I spread them out across the living room floor the way my father used to do with his paperwork, kneeling carefully so the corners stayed aligned. Deeds, statements, copies of old correspondence. Things that only matter if you know how to read them, and if you don't, look like meaningless clutter. I went to bed around 3 that morning with the folder still open beside the couch. When my alarm went off at 6 a.m., I didn't hit snooze. I'd already been awake for a while, staring at the ceiling, replaying the email in my head. At work, I did what I always do when something feels wrong. I followed the process. I logged in. I cleared my inbox. I reviewed claims. I flagged inconsistencies. I did not mention the power of attorney document to anyone, not even to my sister, who texted me around noon asking if I wanted to come over for dinner that night. Can't tonight, I replied. Long day. It wasn't a lie. My job has trained me not to react immediately. When you work in compliance, emotion is noise. You don't raise alarms based on instincts. You document, you cross-reference, you wait until you're certain. Still, the idea that my uncle had been granted authority over my father's affairs authority that, until recently, had been shared kept pressing against my thoughts like a bruise you forget about until you bump it again. My uncle, Mark, has always been the organized one in the family. That's the story everyone tells, anyway. He's the one who volunteers to handle logistics, who talks comfortably with lawyers and accountants, who uses phrases like best interest and long-term planning without blinking. He's also the one who has never asked for permission. Growing up, Mark lived 2 states away, in a large house with a 3-car garage and a lawn that never seemed to have weeds. Holidays were his domain. Schedules ran on his time. If he said dinner was at 6, it was at 6. If you were late, he'd smile and continue eating. I used to admire that about him. Confidence looks a lot like competence when you're young. After my father died, Mark stepped in naturally. He organized the funeral. He made the calls. He told me, more than once, to focus on healing and let the adults handle the rest. I was 31 years old at the time. I'd believed him. By the end of the workday, my head hurt in that dull, compressed way it does when you've been staring at fine print for too long. I drove home, parked in the same spot I always use, and sat in the car again without turning off the engine. The sun was setting behind the row of townhouses across the street, casting long shadows over the pavement. Somewhere nearby, a dog barked once, then stopped. Nothing looked different. That bothered me more than anything else. Inside, I made pasta because it was easy and didn't require thought. I ate standing at the counter, scrolling through my phone. No messages from Mark, no follow-up email, no explanation. I checked my voicemail, even though I knew there wouldn't be anything there. Then I pulled the folder back out. This time, I read everything slowly. One document caught my attention in a way the others hadn't. It was an old insurance policy, dated nearly 15 years earlier, back when my parents were still married and we all lived in a smaller house in Tempe. The policy had been amended several times over the years, but one detail remained unchanged: the designated contact. Not Mark. Me. I frowned at the page, then flipped to another document. A healthcare directive. Again, my name. A handwritten note from my father, initialed, explaining his reasoning. He'd trusted me to follow instructions exactly as written. I sat back on my heels and let that settle. This wasn't about whether my uncle was capable. It was about intent. Someone had decided that my father's trust in me was inconvenient, and instead of discussing it, they'd worked around it. I didn't call Mark that night. I didn't call anyone. I wanted to hear what would happen next without prompting it myself. Silence has a way of making people reveal their assumptions. Sure enough, 2 days later, I got a call. Mark didn't start with an apology. He started with reassurance. "I heard there might have been some confusion," he said, his voice warm and steady through the speaker. "I just wanted to clear things up." I leaned against the kitchen counter and said nothing. "We were trying to move quickly," he continued. "Your dad's accounts needed oversight, and with your workload, I didn't want to burden you." Burden. The word slid into place too smoothly. "It was temporary," he added. "Purely administrative." I pictured the notary stamp, the clean signatures. "Why wasn't I told?" I asked. There was a pause. Not long enough to sound guilty, just long enough to sound measured. "I assumed you'd understand," he said. "You're not really involved in that side of things." That was the moment something shifted. Not because of what he said, but because of how certain he was. In his mind, this wasn't a violation. It was efficiency. "I need time to look things over," I said. "Of course," he replied quickly. "Take all the time you need." We hung up. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the dark screen of my phone. That night, I started looking at things I'd never thought to question before. Old emails, meeting notes, shared documents I still had access to through an old family account that hadn't been deactivated. It wasn't hacking, it wasn't snooping, it was my information, stored carelessly, assumed forgotten. Patterns began to emerge. Changes were always framed as favors. Decisions were always presented after the fact. Responsibility shifted quietly, always away from me, never toward me. I thought about how many times I'd said okay without asking a follow-up question. How often I'd deferred because I didn't want conflict, because I trusted the process. That trust had been misplaced. By the end of the week, I had a timeline laid out on my dining table. Dates, actions, signatures. Nothing illegal, nothing explosive. Just enough to tell a story. A story where I was present, named, and deliberately sidelined. The realization didn't make me angry. It made me precise. I understood now that this wasn't about reclaiming something I'd lost. It was about deciding what I was willing to let continue. For the first time since my father died, I stopped assuming that fairness would arrive on its own. And for the first time, I stopped waiting for someone to include me. I wasn't invisible. I'd been strategically ignored. And that was something I knew how to handle. Once I started looking at my family the way I look at a case file, the emotional noise faded. What was left was structure. At work, we talk a lot about intent versus impact. People rarely wake up thinking, I'm going to harm someone today. Harm usually comes from confidence, from believing you're right, from deciding the outcome matters more than the process. My family had a process. I just wasn't part of it. Growing up, I was the reliable one, not the loud one, not the impressive one, the one who remembered birthdays, who showed up early, who followed instructions. My parents used to joke that if there was ever an emergency, I'd be the one holding the flashlight while everyone else argued. At the time, I thought that was a compliment. Mark, on the other hand, was decisive. That's the word people use when they mean he doesn't ask. He speaks in conclusions, not questions. Even now, when I replay our phone call in my head, I notice how he framed everything as already settled. We moved quickly. It was handled. There was no space in his language for disagreement. The more I paid attention, the more I realized how long this dynamic had been in place. Years, at least. Maybe longer. I'd just never seen it clearly because nothing important had been at stake. Or maybe things had been at stake, and I hadn't noticed. I thought about the small moments. The holiday schedules sent out without asking if I was available. The financial updates delivered as summaries, never drafts. The way conversations ended with, "Don't worry about it, we've got it covered." Covered meant controlled. I went back through old emails, not looking for proof of wrongdoing, but for tone. Who initiated conversations? Who responded? Who decided when things were final? The pattern was consistent. Mark proposed. Others agreed. I was informed. When my father was alive, he'd buffered that dynamic without calling attention to it. He listened. He explained. He slowed things down. After he was gone, the friction disappeared, and so did my voice. That's when I understood something uncomfortable. No one had taken my place. They'd removed it. I didn't confront anyone with this realization. I didn't announce it. I let it sit, heavy and undeniable, the way truths often are, once you stop pushing them away. Instead, I paid attention to how people treated me in small ways. My sister asking for updates but never offering information. Mark calling to check in, only after something had already been decided. The way conversations tightened whenever I asked a clarifying question. It wasn't hostility, it was impatience. They weren't afraid of me. They were annoyed by the idea that I might slow them down. One evening, I stopped by my sister's house to drop off a box of old photos she'd asked for months earlier. She thanked me, took the box, and immediately set it aside. We stood in her kitchen, making polite conversation about work and the weather. "Mark's been really helpful lately," she said casually, pouring herself a glass of wine. "It's nice not having to think about everything." I nodded. "He's just better at that stuff," she added, like she was stating a fact, not making a judgment. I thought about the documents on my dining table, the directives my father had written in his careful handwriting, the trust he'd placed in me to carry out instructions, not reinterpret them. Better at that stuff. I didn't argue. There was nothing to argue about. This wasn't about ability. It was about alignment. My family values efficiency over consent, results over inclusion. They believe that if the outcome is good, the method doesn't matter. I believe the opposite. That difference had always been there. It just hadn't been tested. Now it was. Back at home, I opened my laptop and reviewed the folder again, this time with a different lens. I wasn't looking for leverage. I was looking for boundaries. What was mine to act on? What wasn't? The documents were clear. My role hadn't been revoked entirely. It had been narrowed, redirected, contained. They'd left me just enough involvement to keep things smooth. Just enough responsibility to absorb fallout if something went wrong. Not enough authority to stop anything from happening. It was elegant, in a way. Almost admirable. I thought about calling a lawyer. Not to fight, but to ask questions. In the end, I didn't. Not yet. I wanted to understand the full shape of the system before stepping outside it. Instead, I did something simpler. I stopped volunteering information. When Mark emailed updates, I acknowledged receipt without commentary. When my sister asked for reassurance, I gave neutral responses. I didn't offer suggestions. I didn't flag concerns. At first, no one noticed. Then things got slightly messy. An appointment was scheduled incorrectly. A form was submitted without a supporting document. Small issues, nothing serious. But for the first time, someone had to double back. Mark called me again. "Hey," he said, lighter than before. "Just wanted to make sure you saw the revised timeline." "I did," I replied. "Any thoughts?" There it was, the question he'd never asked. "I don't have any input on that," I said. Another pause, longer this time. "Well," he said slowly, "if you think of anything, let me know." After we hung up, I sat on the couch and stared at the blank TV screen. I wasn't enjoying this. I wasn't trying to make a point. I was watching what happened when I stopped compensating for a system that excluded me. The answer was clear. They needed me, just not enough to listen to me. That realization didn't hurt the way I expected it to. It clarified something fundamental. My role in this family had never been about trust. It had been about utility. I slept better that night than I had in weeks. Not because anything was resolved, but because I'd stopped pretending we were all playing by the same rules. The next morning, as I was leaving for work, I noticed the HOA notice taped crookedly to my door, a reminder about trash pickup times. I smiled at it, an odd, fleeting thing. Rules only work when everyone agrees they matter. And for the first time, I was ready to decide which rules I would keep following and which ones no longer applied to me. Whatever came next, it wouldn't be accidental. They had built their system carefully. So would I. There's a moment when you're trained to look for risk, when something shifts from theoretical to real. It's subtle. A line moves from the possible exposure column to the one labeled active. Nothing has happened yet. No damage. No loss. Just the quiet understanding that it can. That's where I was. The power of attorney hadn't stripped me of everything. Not yet. On paper, I still existed. My name still appeared in places that mattered, just not where decisions were being made. It was like being listed as an emergency exit that no one planned to use unless the building was already on fire. What unsettled me wasn't what I'd lost. It was what was now vulnerable. My father's estate was modest by most standards. No yachts. No vacation homes. A primary residence that had long since been paid off. A handful of accounts. A life insurance policy. And one thing my family never talked about openly but relied on heavily. His medical directive. My father had been precise about it. He didn't like uncertainty, especially when it came to his health. Years before he died, after watching a friend spend months on life support with no clear outcome, he sat me down at the kitchen table with a stack of papers and a pen that leaked ink. "If I can't speak for myself," he said, "I don't want decisions made based on convenience." He'd looked at me when he said it. Not my mother, not my brother, me. The directive was clear. Specific instructions, specific conditions. It was the one document I knew, without question, he wouldn't want altered or overridden. And now, authority over enforcing it had shifted. Not officially revoked, not announced, just rerouted. I pulled the document out again and read it line by line. The language was firm but humane. It left room for judgment, but only within defined boundaries. It was the kind of document lawyers respect because it anticipates pressure. Pressure was exactly what I was worried about. Mark had a way of framing decisions as inevitable. He believed deeply in minimizing friction, in choosing the option that made things simpler for everyone involved. I could already hear how he'd explain things if the situation arose. "Your father wouldn't want us to drag this out. We have to think practically. This is what makes the most sense right now." I'd heard versions of those sentences my entire life. The problem wasn't that Mark would deliberately ignore my father's wishes. The problem was that he'd interpret them. And interpretation is where people like Mark operate best. I didn't say any of this out loud. I didn't accuse. I didn't warn. I just adjusted how I moved through the situation. I began documenting things the way I would at work, quietly and thoroughly. Dates of conversations, summaries of what was said, who initiated contact, who concluded discussions. Nothing dramatic, nothing confrontational, just a record. The more I wrote, the more I noticed how often decisions were framed as urgent, how quickly temporary arrangements became permanent, how easily people accepted changes when they were tired or overwhelmed. I thought about the last hospital visit, months earlier, when my father had been disoriented and exhausted. Mark had taken the lead then too, speaking to doctors while I sat beside the bed, holding my father's hand. I'd trusted that if something important came up, I'd be included. Now, I wasn't so sure. One afternoon, I got a call from an unknown number. I almost let it go to voicemail, but something made me answer. It was a care coordinator from the hospital network my father used. She was calling to confirm updated contact information. "I just want to make sure we have the correct primary decision maker on file," she said. My stomach tightened. "Who do you currently have listed?" I asked. She hesitated, then read out Mark's name. "And secondary?" I asked. There was a pause. Papers shuffling. "It looks like that field is blank," she said. Blank. I thanked her and ended the call, then sat very still at my desk. The office around me hummed with the usual sounds, keyboards, printers, distant voices, but it all felt far away. This wasn't an error. This was a shift. I pulled out my phone and opened the email from weeks earlier, the one I'd been CC'd on by mistake. I read it again with this new information in mind. The language made more sense now. The urgency, the finality. They weren't just streamlining paperwork. They were consolidating control. I thought about calling Mark right then, demanding an explanation, forcing the issue into the open. But that would have turned this into a confrontation, and I didn't want one. Confrontations make people defensive. Defensive people hide things. Instead, I did what I always do when I need clarity. I waited. Over the next few days, I made small, deliberate inquiries. I called the insurance provider to verify beneficiary information. I contacted the hospital again to confirm that my father's directive was still on file, unchanged. It was. But enforcement authority remained. Flexible. That was the word the coordinator used. Flexible. Flexibility benefits whoever has the power to decide when it applies. At home, I pulled the manila folder out again and added a new section. I labeled it simply, Medical. As I organized the papers, I noticed something I'd missed before. A sticky note tucked inside the directive, written in my father's handwriting. "If there's disagreement, slow it down." I stared at the words for a long time. He'd known this could happen. Not this exact situation, maybe, but the shape of it. The tendency for others to rush decisions in the name of practicality. The way his wishes could be reframed if no one insisted on honoring them exactly. He hadn't trusted the system to protect him. He'd trusted me. That realization didn't come with anger. It came with responsibility. This wasn't about reclaiming authority for its own sake. It was about preventing harm before it happened. About making sure that when the moment came, if it ever did, the decisions made would reflect intention, not convenience. I went to bed that night with a plan forming quietly in my mind. Not a confrontation. Not a reversal. A safeguard. The next morning, Mark emailed again. Another update. Another set of attachments. Another request for acknowledgement. I replied with a single sentence. Received, reviewing. It was true, and it was enough. Because for the first time, I wasn't reacting to what they'd already done. I was preparing for what they might try to do next. The value at risk wasn't money. It wasn't property. It was my father's voice. And I wasn't going to let it be rewritten. The moment everything crossed from concern into certainty didn't happen in a courtroom or a hospital room. It happened in my inbox. It was a Thursday afternoon, just after 4. I remember because I'd already shut down my work computer and was halfway through packing my bag when my phone buzzed with a notification. Another email from Mark. Subject line neutral, polite, almost reassuring. Quick update. I didn't open it right away. I put my laptop into my bag, zipped it closed, and walked out of the office like I always do. The parking lot was full of heat and glare. My car interior felt like an oven when I opened the door. I turned on the engine, cranked the air conditioning, and sat there until the steering wheel stopped burning my hands. Then I opened the email. It wasn't long. 3 short paragraphs. No attachments this time. Mark thanked everyone for being flexible over the last few weeks. He mentioned progress, momentum, the importance of being proactive. Then, halfway through the second paragraph, he slipped in the sentence that changed everything. Given the updated authority structure, I've authorized the care team to proceed if needed, without delay. Authorized. Proceed. Without delay. My chest tightened, sharp and sudden. I read the sentence again, then again, slower this time, isolating each word like I was reading a clause in a contract. This wasn't about paperwork anymore. This was about action. I scrolled back up to the top of the email, then down again, searching for context. There was none. No explanation of what proceed meant, no clarification of conditions, just the assumption that everyone understood. Everyone except me. I called him immediately. He answered on the second ring. "Hey," he said, cheerful. "What's up?" "What did you authorize?" I asked. There was a pause. Longer than usual. I could hear traffic in the background, a turn signal clicking. "Nothing dramatic," he said. "Just making sure there aren't any bottlenecks." "That's not an answer." He sighed, the sound carefully calibrated to convey patience. "Look, if something happens and your dad needs intervention, we can't afford delays. Doctors don't like uncertainty." "They don't," I agreed. "That's why he wrote a directive." Another pause. "Of course," Mark said, "and we'll respect it. It's not common. We'll interpret it," he meant. "When did you speak to the care team?" I asked. "Earlier this week. And you didn't think to tell me." "I didn't want to worry you," he replied smoothly. "You've got enough on your plate." There it was again. That phrase, that assumption. "You don't have the authority to override his directive," I said. "I'm not overriding anything," Mark replied. "I'm ensuring continuity." I closed my eyes. This was the inciting moment. I could feel it settle into place, cold and immovable. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a miscommunication. This was intent. "I need you to put that authorization in writing," I said. "It already is," he replied. "That email, that's not sufficient." "For you, maybe," he said. "For the hospital it is." I didn't argue after that. There was nothing left to say on the phone. We hung up, and I sat in my car listening to the hum of the engine, my heart beating faster than I liked. This was the point of no return. He had acted without consulting me. He had positioned himself as the final decision-maker. And he had done it quietly, professionally, with language that made it sound responsible. If something happened now, my father's wishes wouldn't be ignored outright. They'd be interpreted away. I drove home on autopilot, barely registering the familiar turns. Inside, I dropped my bag by the door and went straight to the filing cabinet. The manila folder came out again, heavier than before, like it had absorbed the weight of what I now understood. I spread the documents across the table and read the directive one more time. The language was precise. Clear thresholds, clear refusals. If there's disagreement, slow it down. Mark had done the opposite. I opened my laptop and began documenting the call. Time, date, exact phrasing. I attached the email, saved copies, backed them up. Not because I planned to use them immediately, but because once someone crosses a line like this, you don't assume they'll stop on their own. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I imagined a phone call in the middle of the night, a decision already made, a signature already applied. In the morning, I called the hospital. I didn't accuse, I didn't demand. I asked questions. What's the protocol if there's disagreement among decision-makers? Is the original directive still on file? What qualifies as authorization in your system? The answers were careful, vague. But one thing was clear. If Mark initiated action, things would move quickly. Too quickly. I thanked them and hung up, my hands steady even though my thoughts weren't. Then I sat at the kitchen table and stared at the wall for a long time. This was the event that forced my hand. Not because something had already happened, but because something could happen at any moment. Mark hadn't taken everything. He'd done something worse. He'd created a situation where waiting would become dangerous. That afternoon, my sister texted me. "Mark says things are handled. Try not to stress." I stared at the message until the screen dimmed. Handled. I didn't reply. For the first time since this began, I understood that silence was no longer neutral. It wasn't observation. It wasn't patience. It was permission. And I wasn't willing to give that anymore. Whatever I did next had to be decisive, quiet, and irreversible. It had to protect my father's wishes without turning this into a public war. I closed the folder and slid it back into the cabinet. The decision had already been made, just not by them this time. And unlike Mark, I wasn't going to mistake speed for responsibility. I didn't confront Mark after that call. I didn't send a follow-up email. I didn't loop in my sister or demand a meeting. That was the first decision I made that surprised even me. Everything in me wanted to react, to correct the record, to remind him, loudly, that my father had trusted me, that the directive existed for a reason, that he didn't get to redefine authority just because it was convenient. But reaction was what Mark expected. He thrived on urgency, on momentum, on people scrambling to catch up to decisions he'd already framed as necessary. If I rushed in now, emotional and angry, I'd be playing on his field. So I didn't. Instead, I slowed down. The morning after his email, I woke up early and went for a walk around my neighborhood. The air was already warm, the kind of Arizona heat that settles into your skin before the sun is fully up. The same woman across the street was watering her plants. She waved. I waved back. Ordinary life continued. That was important. I needed to stay anchored in that feeling. Grounded. Because what I was about to do required clarity, not adrenaline. At work, I did my job as usual. I reviewed files. I flagged inconsistencies. I followed procedures. No one there knew what was happening in my personal life, and that anonymity felt like a relief. Systems behave predictably when you respect their rules. People don't. At lunch, I sat in my car and reread the directive again, not looking for reassurance this time, but for leverage. Not the aggressive kind, the procedural kind. The directive didn't just state preferences. It outlined process, conditions, escalation steps, what to do when authority conflicted. It wasn't emotional. It was methodical. My father had anticipated exactly this kind of situation. That realization steadied me. Instead of pushing back publicly, I began positioning quietly. I made a list. Not of accusations, but of actions. Confirm who currently had access to medical decision portals. Verify how authorization was logged internally. Clarify what constituted an emergency under hospital policy. Identify where delays could legally and ethically be inserted. This wasn't sabotage, it was compliance. I wasn't trying to stop care. I was trying to stop unilateral care. That afternoon, Mark emailed again. Another update, another request for acknowledgement. I replied with 2 words. Noted, thanks. It was polite, neutral, completely unthreatening. I imagined him reading it, assuming I'd fallen back into line. That assumption worked in my favor. Over the next few days, I made myself scarce without disappearing. I answered messages, but slowly. I asked questions that sounded curious, not challenging. Just so I understand the process. Can you clarify how that works if circumstances change? Who makes the call if there's disagreement? Mark responded quickly at first, then more carefully. His answers grew longer, more hedged. He began CCing others. That told me everything I needed to know. When people start building audiences, it's because they want cover. I never accused him of overstepping. I never referenced the phone call directly. I let the paper trail speak for itself. One evening, I received a forwarded message from my sister. It was from Mark, reassuring her that everything was under control and that I was looped in. I stared at that phrase for a long time. Looped in. It didn't mean consulted. It didn't mean agreed. It meant informed after the fact. And yet, that distinction mattered only to me. To everyone else, it sounded responsible. That's when I understood the real danger. Mark wasn't acting out of malice. He was acting out of certainty. He believed his judgment was superior. that his ability to move quickly outweighed the need for consensus. In his mind, opposition was inefficiency, which meant that if I challenged him directly, he wouldn't see it as a boundary. He'd see it as obstruction, so I didn't obstruct. I prepared. Late one night, I opened my laptop and began drafting a document. Not a letter, not a complaint, a summary. Timeline. Actions taken. Authorizations issued. Points where the directive required pause. I wrote it the way I write internal reports at work. Dry, factual, unemotional, each claim backed by a reference. I didn't send it to anyone. Not yet. Instead, I saved it in 3 places. The next morning, I called the hospital again. This time, I asked to speak to someone in compliance. I didn't mention Mark by name. I asked hypotheticals. What happens if a directive specifies delay, but a decision-maker pushes for speed? How do you resolve conflicts between stated wishes and perceived best interest? What documentation is required if authority is exercised over objection? The woman on the phone was careful, but she answered. Policies were policies. They didn't bend for personalities. By the end of the call, I had what I needed. Not a weapon, a safeguard. I thanked her and hung up, my hands steady. That night, Mark called again. I just wanted to check in, he said. You've been quiet. I've been reviewing, I replied. Any concerns? There it was again, the opening. No, I said truthfully. Just making sure I understand the full process. He laughed softly. That's you, always thorough. I smiled, even though he couldn't see it. Yes, I said, I am. After we hung up, I sat on the couch and let the silence settle. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel angry. I felt ready. This phase wasn't about confrontation or exposure. It was about refusing to be rushed into complicity, about choosing restraint when reaction would have been easier. Mark believed that authority belonged to whoever acted first. I believed something else. That authority belongs to whoever is willing to slow things down when slowing down is the only ethical choice. I hadn't made my move yet, but when I did, it wouldn't look like resistance. It would look like procedure, and by the time Mark realized what was happening, it would already be in motion. The evidence didn't arrive the way I expected. There was no dramatic discovery, no single moment where everything snapped into focus. It came the way most real proof does, quietly, through routine, wrapped in something ordinary enough that no one thought to hide it. It started with a voicemail. I almost deleted it without listening. Unknown number, no transcription preview. Just a timestamp from the previous afternoon, 3:42 p.m. While I'd been in a meeting at work, I listened to it standing in my kitchen, the microwave humming softly behind me. Hi, this message is for Mark, a woman's voice said, calm, professional. This is Elaine from Care Coordination. Just confirming that we'll proceed per your authorization if conditions escalate. We have the directive on file, but based on your guidance, we understand urgency takes precedence. Please call back if anything changes. There was a pause, the faint sound of papers shifting. And just to note, she added, we'll document this as discussed. The message ended. I stood there longer than necessary, phone pressed to my ear even though the call was over. My reflection stared back at me from the microwave door, my face unreadable, like I was watching someone else absorb the information. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't phrasing. This was process being bent. The voicemail itself wasn't illegal. It didn't violate policy outright. But it did something more important. It established intent. Mark hadn't just authorized action. He'd framed urgency as a higher priority than my father's explicit instruction to slow things down in case of disagreement. And he'd done it verbally, which meant it existed in time, not just interpretation. I saved the voicemail immediately, renamed the file, backed it up, added it to the growing digital folder I'd been quietly maintaining. Then I sat down and wrote a brief note to myself describing where it came from, when I received it, and what it referenced. No adjectives, no speculation, just facts. That night, I didn't sleep much. Not because I was panicking, but because my mind kept replaying the same realization. Mark didn't think this was wrong. He thought it was responsible. The next piece of evidence arrived 2 days later, buried in something even more mundane. An audit log. As part of my job, I regularly request access logs and metadata when reviewing compliance issues. Systems track everything: who logged in, what was accessed, when changes were made. Most people forget that. Apparently, Mark had too. I requested a standard access report from the hospital's patient portal under my father's account, citing a routine verification of records. It took a day to arrive. When it did, I opened it at my dining table with a cup of coffee and a highlighter, like I was reviewing any other file. The report was dense, pages of timestamps and user IDs. At first glance, nothing unusual. Then I noticed a pattern. Every time I accessed the directive, it was read-only, logged, unchanged. Every time Mark accessed it, there was a second entry immediately afterward. Override note added. Not a change to the directive itself, just a note field. A place for interpretation. For context. For guidance. I cross-referenced the timestamps with the voicemail date. They matched. I leaned back in my chair and let out a slow breath. This was it. Not a smoking gun. Not something you'd splash across a courtroom screen, but enough. Enough to show that the directive was being actively reframed. Enough to show that Mark wasn't just preparing for a hypothetical emergency, he was shaping the narrative in advance. And he was doing it quietly, in places most people never look. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired, because this wasn't about catching him. It was about realizing how easily good intentions slide into control when no one insists on boundaries. I added the audit log to my folder, highlighted the relevant entries, noted the correlation, saved everything again. Still, I didn't act. Not yet. I wanted to understand the full shape of what I was dealing with. Evidence is only useful if you know how and when to use it. The third piece came unexpectedly. I was at work, mid-morning, when an email popped up from someone I didn't recognize. Subject line vague. Reclarification. I opened it. It was from a junior administrator at the hospital. She apologized for bothering me and explained that she'd been cleaning up documentation inconsistencies when she noticed conflicting notes attached to my father's file. She wasn't sure which guidance took precedence and wanted confirmation before finalizing the record. Attached was a PDF. I downloaded it and opened it, my pulse steady but alert. The document showed two summaries. One was my father's directive, quoted accurately. The other was a paraphrased guidance note attributed to Mark. It softened language, removed conditions, replaced delay with discretion. It was subtle, almost elegant. I stared at the screen, feeling something settle deep in my chest. This wasn't malicious editing, it was translation. Mark was translating my father's wishes into something he could work with, and in doing so, he was erasing the very thing my father had been most clear about. I replied to the administrator carefully. Thank you for flagging this. The original directive governs. Please do not finalize any documentation that conflicts with its stated conditions. I'm happy to discuss further if needed. I didn't mention Mark. I didn't attach evidence. I simply reasserted the rule. Minutes later, she replied with a brief acknowledgement. That exchange mattered more than it seemed, because it created a counter-record. From that moment on, there was documentation showing that I had objected, that I had clarified, that I had attempted to enforce the directive as written. Mark could no longer claim unanimous understanding. That afternoon, I added a new section to my folder. Evidence. Not screenshots. Not angry emails. Not emotional appeals. Voicemail. Audit logs. Conflicting documentation. Time-stamped objections. Each piece ordinary on its own. Together, they formed something solid. Still, I didn't feel like I was winning. Because the more I saw, the clearer it became that this wasn't a battle between right and wrong. It was a clash between two ways of seeing responsibility. Mark believed responsibility meant acting decisively. I believed responsibility meant honoring limits. And now, for the first time, I had proof that those two definitions couldn't coexist. I closed my laptop and looked around my quiet living room. Beige walls. The filing cabinet in the corner. My father's handwriting preserved in folders and notes. This evidence didn't give me power. It gave me choice. I could expose him. I could escalate. I could force a confrontation that would fracture what remained of my family. Or I could wait. Because something told me, this system, this carefully managed structure Mark had built, wasn't designed to withstand scrutiny. And when it was finally tested, Speed wouldn't protect him. Procedure would. I wasn't ready to move yet. But now, I knew exactly what I was holding. And I wasn't going to drop it. It took me longer than I want to admit to understand that Mark wasn't afraid of what he was doing. That realization came not with anger, but with a strange kind of clarity. Once I saw it, everything else made sense. I'd been operating under the assumption that if I gathered enough evidence, if I documented carefully enough, Mark would eventually hesitate. That he'd pause, reconsider, maybe even correct course once he realized how close he was to crossing a line. He didn't hesitate because, in his mind, there was no line. The voicemail, the audit logs, the paraphrased guidance. None of it registered as wrongdoing to him. It registered as leadership. That became clear during a family video call my sister insisted on scheduling, just to make sure we're all on the same page. The phrase should have warned me, but I agreed anyway. I wanted to hear how Mark explained things when he wasn't rushing or multitasking. We logged on at 7 in the evening. My sister sat at her dining table, a half-empty glass of wine beside her laptop. Mark appeared from his home office, bookshelf carefully arranged behind him. He looked relaxed, comfortable. "Thanks for joining," my sister said. "I just think there's been a lot of stress, and maybe we should talk it through." Mark smiled at the camera. "I agree. Communication is important." I said nothing. He leaned forward slightly, hands folded. "I want to be very clear about something," he said, his tone measured. "Everything I've done has been in your father's best interest." There it was. The foundation. "I've worked with doctors," he continued. "I've coordinated care. I've made sure there are no delays if something happens. That's responsibility." I watched his face as he spoke. He wasn't defensive. He wasn't evasive. He was confident. "When decisions have to be made," he added, "someone has to make them." My sister nodded. "That makes sense." I finally spoke. "That's not what the directive says." Mark didn't bristle. He didn't raise his voice. "I know what it says," he replied calmly. "I've read it." "And you still authorized action without consultation?" "Yes," he said, without hesitation. The room went quiet. "I did," he repeated, "because the directive allows for discretion, and I exercised it." "It allows for discretion within limits," I said. "And I determined those limits hadn't been crossed," he said. "Look, I understand you're attached to the wording. That's your nature. But at some point, you have to trust judgment." Judgment. That was the word that settled everything for me. This wasn't about misunderstanding my father's wishes. Mark understood them perfectly. He just believed his judgment superseded them when necessary. I looked at my sister. "Do you agree with that?" She hesitated, then shrugged. "I just don't think Dad would want us arguing over technicalities." Technicalities. That's what boundaries become when they're inconvenient. I realized then that this conversation wasn't happening on the same moral plane. I was talking about consent, limits, and process. They were talking about outcomes and efficiency. Neither side thought the other was evil. That's what made it dangerous. Mark wasn't a villain. He wasn't trying to erase my father's voice. He genuinely believed he was protecting him from suffering, from delay, from indecision, and in doing so, he felt justified in bending rules that slowed him down. I ended the call politely. No accusations, no threats. Afterward, I sat in the dark living room, laptop closed, the silence pressing in. I felt oddly calm, because the question I'd been circling for weeks had finally been answered. Mark wasn't going to stop. Not because he couldn't, because he didn't think he should. That realization reframed everything. This wasn't a conflict that could be resolved by explanation, or by appealing to shared values. We didn't share the same values anymore. He believed authority was earned through decisiveness. I believed authority was constrained by consent. And when those two beliefs collide, the more patient one loses unless they change the field entirely. I opened my folder again, not to add anything, but to look at it differently. Not as evidence to be used against Mark, but as context for the system he was operating within. Hospitals don't move on emotion. Compliance departments don't respond to confidence. They respond to documentation, objection, and risk exposure. Mark was acting like a manager. I needed to act like a constraint. That night, I drafted another document. Shorter this time. Tighter. It outlined, in neutral language, the risk of proceeding under conflicting guidance, the potential liability, the ambiguity created by override notes that contradicted an active directive. I didn't accuse anyone of misconduct. I described exposure. This wasn't escalation. It was alignment with the system that existed beyond my family. The next morning, I sent it to exactly one person. Not Mark. Not my sister. The hospital's compliance office. I didn't frame it as a complaint. I framed it as a concern. I'm writing to flag a potential conflict between a patient's documented directive and subsequent guidance notes. I want to ensure all actions remain consistent with policy and legal standards. I attached nothing. I named no one. I simply asked for clarification. Within an hour, I received a response acknowledging receipt and stating that the matter would be reviewed. That was it. No drama. No confrontation. But the system had been alerted. And systems, unlike people, don't care how confident you sound. They care about risk. For the first time since this began, I felt something close to relief, not because things were fixed, but because they were no longer invisible. Mark believed he was acting alone, decisively, in the background. He wasn't. He was now operating under observation, and the irony was sharp enough to make me smile. He'd always said I worried too much about process. But process was the only thing standing between my father's wishes and someone else's judgment. I closed my laptop and went to bed early that night. Not because I was exhausted, because I knew, with absolute certainty, that the balance had shifted. Mark still thought this was about doing the right thing. Soon, he would learn that doing the right thing isn't the same as being allowed to decide what right means. And when that realization came, it wouldn't come from me. It would come from the system he'd been so confident he controlled. The shift didn't announce itself. There was no email marked urgent, no sudden change in tone, no apology wrapped in professional language. If I hadn't been paying attention, I might have missed it entirely. That, I realized, was the point. 2 days after I contacted the hospital's compliance office, Mark's emails changed, not in content, but in structure. Where he used to write in declarative sentences, "I've authorized," "We're proceeding," "This is handled," his language softened. "We're reviewing options." "The team is assessing next steps. We'll circle back once we have clarity." Clarity. I read the word 3 times and smiled despite myself. Clarity is what people ask for when certainty is no longer theirs. I didn't respond any differently than I had before. Polite acknowledgments, neutral language, no commentary. If he was looking for resistance, I wasn't going to give it to him. Instead, I made one deliberate move. I requested formal recognition as an objecting party. Not loudly, not publicly. Procedurally. There's a mechanism for it, buried in policy language that almost no one reads unless they have to. A way to document that a legally designated individual does not consent to expedited action under ambiguous circumstances. It doesn't revoke authority. It doesn't override decision-makers. What it does is trigger review. I submitted the request electronically late one evening, sitting at my dining table with the manila folder open beside me. The process took less than 10 minutes. I uploaded the directive, referenced the conflicting guidance, checked the box that indicated my objection was based on documented instructions. Then I clicked submit. There was no fanfare. Just a confirmation number. I wrote it down in my notebook, closed my laptop, and went to bed. The next morning, my phone rang at 8:12 a.m. Mark. I let it go to voicemail. A minute later, a text. "Can you call me when you get a chance?" I finished my coffee. I got dressed. I left for work. I didn't rush. When I finally called him back during my lunch break, his tone was different. Still controlled, but strained at the edges. "Hey," he said. "I just wanted to understand what's going on." "What do you mean?" I asked. "I got a notice this morning," he said carefully. "From the hospital. About a review." I said nothing. "They're asking for clarification around decision authority," he continued. "And they mentioned an objection." Another pause. "Was that you?" "Yes," I said. There it was. No accusation, no defense, just a statement of fact. "Why didn't you come to me first?" he asked. I took a breath. "Because you'd already decided," I said. "And because this isn't personal. It's procedural. He exhaled sharply. This is going to slow things down. That's the point, I replied. Silence stretched between us. You're creating complications, he said finally. No, I said. I'm documenting them. That was when I understood something else. Mark didn't feel betrayed. He felt inconvenienced. In his mind, I hadn't challenged his authority. I'd disrupted his efficiency. I thought we were aligned, he said. We're not, I replied, keeping my voice steady. And we haven't been for a while. He didn't argue with that. After we hung up, I sat in my car with the windows down, letting the heat wash over me. My hands were steady. My heart wasn't racing. I felt grounded in a way I hadn't since this all began. I hadn't taken power away from Mark. I'd removed his ability to act unilaterally. That difference mattered. Over the next week, the effects rippled outward in small, telling ways. Emails multiplied. CC lists grew longer. Decisions that once took hours now took days. Language became cautious. Conditional. Lawyers were copied. Mark began asking questions he'd never asked before. Do you agree with this approach? Are there any objections? Should we wait for confirmation? I answered when appropriate. I declined when necessary. Always politely. Always in writing. I never referenced the voicemail. I never cited the audit logs. I never threatened escalation. I didn't need to. The system was doing what it was designed to do, slow down when risk appeared. My sister called me one evening, frustration bleeding through her voice. Why are you making this so hard? She asked. I'm not, I said. I'm making it accurate. She sighed. Mark's just trying to help. I know, I replied. That's why this matters. She didn't understand that. Maybe she never would. And I didn't try to make her. The most telling moment came during a scheduled call with the care team. Mark was there. I was there. A hospital administrator joined halfway through. The tone was formal, careful. We want to ensure we're aligned with documented patient wishes, the administrator said. Given the conflicting guidance, we'll proceed cautiously. Mark nodded. Of course. I watched his face. The tightness around his mouth. The way his pen paused mid-note. This was new territory for him. He was no longer the unquestioned coordinator. He was one voice among several. After the call, he emailed me privately. We need to talk about boundaries. I read the message once, then closed it. Boundaries. It was an interesting word choice, coming from someone who'd never acknowledged mine. I replied hours later, happy to discuss process going forward. Nothing more. That night, I took the manila folder out one last time and reorganized it. I removed documents I no longer needed, archived older correspondence, consolidated evidence. The folder felt lighter in my hands. Not because the situation was resolved, but because it had shifted into a space I understood. I hadn't walked away. I hadn't disappeared. I hadn't declared war. I had repositioned, from the margins to the mechanism, from emotional stakeholder to procedural constraint. Mark still had authority, but it was no longer unchecked. And that was enough. I stood in my living room, filing cabinet open, and thought about my father's note again. If there's disagreement, slow it down. I'd done exactly that. Not with confrontation, not with accusation, but with structure. For the first time since his death, I felt like I was honoring him in a way that mattered not by fighting louder, but by insisting that his voice remain present when it counted. Whatever happened next, it would happen deliberately. Not because Mark allowed it, but because the system required it. And for the first time, I wasn't waiting to be included. I was already there. The consequences didn't arrive all at once. They never do when you're dealing with systems instead of people. They arrive in fragments, spaced out just enough that no one can point to a single moment and say, this is when it happened. That, too, was by design. The first sign was the calendar. Mark used to send meeting invites with confidence. Fixed times, tight agendas, clear objectives. Now his invites came with caveats. Tentative, pending review, subject to confirmation. I noticed it because I pay attention to language. It's part of my job. Words tell you where pressure is building. The second sign was the lawyers. They appeared quietly on CC lines. Their names unfamiliar at first. Their emails brief and careful. Questions replaced instructions. Clarifications replaced conclusions. Every decision now had to be justified, documented, and defensible. Mark didn't like that. He never said so directly, but I could hear it in the way his messages shortened, the way his tone flattened, the way he stopped calling unless he had to. The system was doing exactly what it was meant to do, slowing him down, not stopping him, not punishing him, just forcing him to explain himself. I stayed consistent. I responded when required. I declined to opine when it wasn't my role. I never overplayed my hand. Overreach is how you lose credibility in environments like this. One afternoon, a notice came through from the hospital's compliance office. Not dramatic. Not accusatory. Review complete. Updated procedures in effect. No details. No explanation. Just confirmation. From that point on, things changed in ways that were subtle but irreversible. Any proposed action now required dual acknowledgement. Any deviation from the directive triggered automatic pause. Override notes were no longer accepted without justification tied directly to documented conditions. Mark could still act. He just couldn't act alone. I found out later through a third party, not Mark, that the compliance review had raised internal concerns about role clarity and interpretive drift, phrases that sound harmless until you realize what they imply. Interpretive drift. It's what happens when guidance becomes habit, and habit replaces instruction. They'd seen it, documented it, corrected for it, without ever naming him. That was the part that stayed with me. The system didn't accuse Mark of wrongdoing. It didn't shame him. It didn't call him out. It simply removed his ability to operate in the gray. For someone like Mark, that was devastating. The effects showed up in our interactions almost immediately. He stopped assuming agreement. He stopped closing conversations unilaterally. He started asking, "Are you okay with this?" instead of, "This is what we're doing." The first time he asked, I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was surreal. Weeks earlier, that question would have sounded unnecessary to him. Now, it was required. My sister noticed the change too, though she framed it differently. "Everything feels so complicated now," she said during a phone call one evening. "It didn't used to be like this." "It was always like this," I replied. "You just didn't see it." She didn't argue. The stress showed in Mark in other ways. He missed a deadline, then another. He forgot to attach a document he referenced. Small things, but out of character for him. Control had always been his anchor. When that slipped, even slightly, it unsettled him. I didn't take satisfaction in that. I didn't feel vindicated. What I felt was relief. Because for the first time since this began, I wasn't bracing for the next unilateral decision. I wasn't checking my phone with a knot in my stomach, wondering if something irreversible had already been done. The danger had passed not because Mark had changed, but because the environment had. That distinction mattered. One evening, Mark called unexpectedly. "I just wanted to update you," he said, his voice tired. "We're holding off on any changes until everything is fully aligned." "Okay," I said. There was a pause. "You know," he added, "this has been harder than it needed to be." I considered that for a moment. "Maybe," I said, "or maybe it's just more visible now." End quote. He didn't respond right away. "I never meant to push you out," he said finally. I believed him. "I know," I replied. "That's not the same as including me." He sighed. "I suppose not." That was the closest thing to acknowledgement I was going to get. And I didn't need more. Because the real consequence of all this wasn't emotional. It was structural. Mark still coordinated care. He still spoke with doctors. He still managed logistics. But now, every step he took left a trail. Every decision had to withstand scrutiny. Every assumption had to be articulated. And that changed how power functioned in the room. I saw it during our next group call with the care team. Mark spoke less, listened more. When he suggested something, he waited for confirmation instead of moving ahead. The administrator facilitated. The process led. It wasn't dramatic. It was effective. After the call, I closed my laptop and sat back, letting the quiet fill the room. The filing cabinet was still there, but I hadn't opened it in days. The manila folder remained untouched. I didn't need it anymore. The system was carrying the weight now. That's the thing about delayed consequences. They don't announce victory. They simply change what's possible going forward. Mark had believed authority meant speed. He'd learned that authority, in the wrong environment, creates exposure. I'd believed patience would cost me. Instead, it had given me leverage without force. My sister texted me later that night. "I think things are settling down." I stared at the message for a long moment before replying. "They are," I wrote. "That's the point." I went to bed that night without setting an alarm, without checking my phone one last time. The hum of the air conditioner was steady, familiar. For the first time in weeks, I slept deeply, not because everything was resolved, but because the situation was no longer accelerating toward harm. And sometimes, that's the only victory that matters. What Mark lost wasn't his role. It was his ability to decide alone. And what I gained wasn't control. It was assurance. The kind that comes not from winning, but from knowing that the worst outcome has been taken off the table not by force, not by confrontation, but by insisting that the rules apply to everyone, even the people who think they're above them. The fallout had arrived, quietly, completely, and it had done exactly what I needed it to do. The opportunity to end it completely came when I wasn't looking for it. That's how these things usually happen. Not with a dramatic reveal, not with a door slammed open, but with a quiet piece of information sliding into your hands when you've already stopped reaching. It was a Monday morning, early, before work. I was drinking coffee at the kitchen counter, scrolling through my email without really reading, when I saw a name I recognized but hadn't expected to see again. Elaine, the care coordinator. The subject line was careful, almost apologetic. Follow-up question. I opened it. She explained that during the compliance review, an internal check had surfaced something unrelated to my original concern. An inconsistency in authorization timing. A discrepancy between verbal instruction and recorded documentation. She wasn't accusing anyone. She was asking for context. Specifically, she wanted to know whether I'd been aware of a conversation Mark had with the care team 2 months earlier, one I hadn't known about at the time. She attached a transcript. Not a recording. A transcription generated from a recorded line used by the hospital for quality assurance. I read it once, then again. Mark's voice was unmistakable. Confident, calm. He referenced my father's directive, acknowledged its language, and then said something that made my stomach drop. "If there's resistance, we'll document urgency. That usually resolves things." Usually. I closed my laptop and stared at the wall, the hum of the refrigerator loud in the silence. This was it. This wasn't interpretation. This wasn't judgment. This was strategy. Mark hadn't just believed he was right. He'd anticipated resistance and planned to neutralize it. The implications were clear. If this transcript became part of the formal record, it wouldn't just slow him down. It would call his entire role into question. It could trigger an external review. It could escalate beyond the hospital. It could affect his professional standing in ways that would follow him for years. This wasn't procedural anymore. This was personal. I sat there for a long time, coffee cooling beside me, weighing what I held. My phone buzzed with a text from my sister about something unrelated. I ignored it. I thought about the months leading up to this moment, the evidence I'd gathered, the restraint I'd practiced, the system I'd relied on to do its job. And I thought about what would happen if I handed this over. Mark would be exposed. Publicly, if it went far enough. Privately, at the very least. He would lose credibility. Possibly his ability to act in this role ever again. My sister would be pulled into it. Lines would be drawn, sides chosen. The family would fracture in a way that wouldn't heal. And for what? To prove that I was right? I closed the laptop and went to get dressed for work. All day, the decision sat with me like a weight I couldn't set down. Every time my mind drifted, it landed back on that transcript. On the word usually. On the casual way Mark had described overriding resistance as an administrative hurdle. At lunch, I sat in my car and read the email from Elaine again. She hadn't asked directly whether I wanted to escalate. She'd asked for context. Clarification. I could respond in a dozen ways. I could forward the transcript to compliance and let the system do what it does best, expand. I could confront Mark and force a reckoning. I could do nothing. By the time I got home that evening, I knew what the right choice was. Not because it was easy, because it was consistent with everything I'd done so far. I opened my laptop one last time and drafted a response. It was short. Thank you for flagging this. I was not aware of that conversation at the time. Based on current safeguards in place, I believe the risk has been adequately addressed. Please let me know if further clarification is needed. I didn't attach the transcript. I didn't name Mark. I didn't push. I hit send and closed the laptop before I could second-guess myself. The next day, Elaine replied with a simple acknowledgement. The matter, she said, would be noted and closed unless further issues arose. Closed. I sat back in my chair and let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. Later that week, Mark called. Not about the review. Not about authority. About something trivial. Scheduling. Logistics. We spoke politely, carefully. There was a new awareness between us, unspoken but present. At one point, he paused. I appreciate you keeping things contained, he said. Contained. I understood what he meant. I did what was necessary, I replied. He didn't push further. After the call, I sat alone in my living room, the late afternoon light slanting across the floor. The filing cabinet stood in the corner, unchanged. The manila folder inside it felt like a different object now, no longer a weapon, no longer a shield. Just history. I thought about what it would have felt like to go all the way. To expose everything. To force acknowledgement through consequence. There was a version of me, earlier in this process, who might have done that, who would have needed the validation, the proof, the apology that never really comes anyway. But that version of me had been operating from injury. This choice came from something else. Responsibility. Not the kind Mark talked about, not decisiveness, not efficiency. The kind that considers collateral damage. The kind that knows when stopping is more ethical than winning. I hadn't spared Mark because I forgave him. I'd spared him because blowing this up would have harmed people who hadn't chosen any of this. My sister, the care team, my father's memory, turned into a public case study instead of a private promise honored. I'd drawn the line where it needed to be drawn. The system was stable. Safeguards were in place. My father's wishes were protected. That was enough. That night, I took the manila folder out of the cabinet and removed one document, the transcript. I didn't destroy it. I didn't share it. I placed it in a separate envelope and wrote a date on the front. Not as a threat. As a reminder, power isn't always exercised by using what you have. Sometimes, it's exercised by knowing you could and choosing not to. For the first time since this began, I felt something settle into place. Not triumph. Not satisfaction. Integrity. And I knew, with a certainty deeper than anything I'd felt before, that this was the moment where everything I believed had been tested and held. The collapse I'd feared never came. Instead, something stronger replaced it. And that was the real twist. Not that I could have destroyed him, but that I didn't need to. Nothing dramatic happened after that. There was no final confrontation, no family meeting where everything was laid bare, no moment where Mark admitted fault or my sister apologized for standing on the sidelines. If you were looking for a clean ending, a scene where everyone learned a lesson at the same time, you would have been disappointed. Life doesn't work that way. What changed instead was quieter and far more permanent. The hospital never called again about conflicting guidance. The care team followed the directive as written, without commentary or improvisation. When questions came up, they were addressed slowly, deliberately, and always with documentation. No one rushed. No one assumed. No one treated urgency as an excuse. Mark continued in his role, but differently. He looped people in before acting. He asked, instead of announcing. When decisions were made, they were made in rooms with more than one voice. My sister adjusted too, though she never named it as such. She stopped forwarding me Mark's reassurances. She started asking my opinion directly. Not often, not dramatically, but enough to signal a shift. I didn't press her for acknowledgement. I didn't need it. The point had never been to be recognized. It had been to be respected by the process, if not by the people. Weeks passed, then months. My life returned to its usual shape. Work, groceries, evenings on the couch with the TV on low. The HOA notice taped crookedly to my door one afternoon because I'd put my trash cans out an hour too early. I smiled at that. Rules are funny that way. They feel oppressive until you realize they're the only thing standing between order and chaos, between intention and assumption. One Sunday morning, I went through my father's filing cabinet for the first time since everything settled. Not because I needed anything, just because I wanted to. I found the same folders. The same careful labels. Receipts neatly stacked. Insurance policies clipped together. His handwriting steady and familiar, even now. At the back of the drawer, I found the sticky note again. If there's disagreement, slow it down. I peeled it off the page and held it in my hand, the paper soft at the edges from age. He'd written it for a moment like this, even if he hadn't known the details. He'd known the pattern. The tendency of others to move fast when slowing down was harder. I understood him better now than I ever had when he was alive. That realization didn't make me sad. It made me grateful. I put the note back where it belonged and closed the drawer. Later that day, I met my sister for lunch. We sat outside a cafe, the Arizona sun warm but manageable, the air smelling faintly of coffee and dust. We talked about normal things. Work, her kids, a trip she was planning. At one point, she hesitated, then said, "I think things are better now." Every 10. I looked at her, really looked. She wasn't asking for reassurance. She wasn't fishing for forgiveness. She was stating an observation. "I think so too," I said. She nodded, relief flickering across her face. We didn't dissect it. We didn't revisit the past. We let the moment pass. That, too, was a kind of boundary. When I got home, I took the envelope with the transcript out of the cabinet and moved it to a box in the closet. Not hidden, just stored, labeled, dated. It wasn't leverage anymore. It was proof that I could be trusted with power and choose restraint. That was the part that mattered most. For a long time, I'd believed fairness was something you earned by being reasonable, by being patient, by trusting that others would act in good faith if you did. I don't believe that anymore. Fairness isn't automatic. It's enforced, not always loudly, not always publicly, but deliberately. And sometimes, enforcing it doesn't look like winning. It looks like preventing harm before it happens, like closing a door quietly instead of slamming it, like leaving someone standing where they are, not because they deserve mercy, but because going further would violate something more important. I didn't fix my family. I fixed my position within it. I no longer assume inclusion. I require clarity. I don't wait for permission to protect what matters. I don't confuse speed with responsibility, or confidence with authority. Most importantly, I don't mistake silence for agreement. That lesson didn't come cheap. It cost me comfort. It cost me certainty. It cost me the illusion that everyone in my family shared the same definition of care. But it gave me something better. Peace that isn't fragile. The kind that doesn't depend on anyone else behaving well. The kind that comes from knowing exactly where you stand and how to stand there without apology. On most days, nothing reminds me of how close this all came to going wrong. That's the point. The absence of disaster isn't dramatic, but it's meaningful. Sometimes, justice isn't a moment you celebrate. It's a future you quietly secure. And when I think about my father now, I don't think about what might have happened if I'd acted differently. I think about the fact that his wishes were honored not because I fought harder, but because I chose carefully. I didn't prove I was right. I proved I was responsible. And that's the one thing no one can ever take from me again.